Hello and good evening to everyone. I'm Dr. Philip McMillan. I've been speaking about COVID 19 since early 2020. My focus has always been on COVID 19, severe disease as a viral mediated autoimmune disease. Throughout the past 3 years, I've had the pleasure of speaking to experts across the world, gaining their insight, understanding a little bit more about their research, and critically getting a better understanding about international issues. And so today I have with me Professor Amitav Banerjee, and we are going to be talking a little bit about the WHO Pandemic Treaty. We'll try and see if we can educate you so that you are well aware of both sides of the discussion. But before we start, I'll just like to remind everyone that this is my way of helping us to try and bring some resolution to the world. Here we have peace for all our children with Israel and Palestine. If there's one thing that I've learned is that if there is war, that can affect everyone in the world. If we just take a few moments each day, remembering the challenges that they are facing, I think the world could become a better place. So, getting right back to where we are, we have Professor Amitav Banerjee here with me. Hi, Amitav, how are you doing?
Hello, good evening. It's a pleasure always to come on this platform.
Excellent, excellent. And so I'll ask you, Amitav, if you can do an introduction of yourself so that we have a better idea as to who you are.
Yeah, that I was a epidemiologist in the armed forces for more 2.5 decades. After that, I have been a professor of epidemiology in a medical school for the past 17, 18 years. So I have worked in epidemiology for almost 4 decades, and uh, relevant to the topic of discussion today, I have been a bioethicist, I would say, for almost a decade because I have been chairing ethical committees of national institutions and private institutions also for the past 10 years. So, a lot of ethical issues I have been dealing with for the past 10 years, and that aroused my interest in the pandemic treaty because when we talk of this treaty, a lot of ethical issues come into play.
Excellent, excellent. And so, Amitav, in terms of, before we get into that, tell me a little bit more in terms of what's happening in India with regards to COVID 19. Has India moved beyond it now, or are they still having what seems to be localized epidemics rather than a global pandemic? Any thoughts on that?
COVID is in the background now because as a country, as a tropical country, we are having major public health problems now. We are having a resurgence of tuberculosis because during the pandemic, 40% tuberculosis detection went down. So we had a short supply of anti-TB drugs also. We are having serious problems of dengue also because post rains we have got a large problem admissions due to dengue and measles. We had few outbreaks of measles because the routine immunization went down during COVID time. So we are overwhelmed with other public health issues, and COVID is now in the background. COVID, nobody discusses COVID. The lay common person also have understood that all health issues are more important. We have got more important health issues than COVID, and we have got a younger population. Like up to 69 years of age, 70 years of age, the mortality from COVID is less than 0.05%, and 97% of our population are below 70 years. So we don't see much COVID deaths that way. So it's
Excellent. So it is good because before we move on to the pandemic treaty, do you have any thoughts about what we seem to be seeing in highly vaccinated regions of the world where we're seeing a resurgence of COVID cases from an epidemiological point of view? Any thoughts about that?
Yeah, that also I have been pointing out for the past 2 years. In fact, I have been following the global patterns after vaccination. There have been surge in Malaysia, Sri Lanka, Australia. There have been surge in Singapore after the vaccination, and now there are data from ONS UK Office of I think National Statistics, which is showing excess mortality. In fact, I believe today only there was a discussion in Parliament by Andrew Bridgens, I think, and not well attended. So they are highly vaccinated countries are having excess deaths, and in fact, countries like Africa and large parts of Asia, which did not have high, particularly Africa, which did not have a high vaccination rate, they are not having excess mortality. So this is something which calls for audit or which requires deep investigation, and we have to pause and consider. At least ecological data shows that countries which are the lesser vaccinated, in India 80% people did not take a single booster. So we did not have any resurgence. After the second wave, we did not have any excess mortality from COVID at least. So that is.
Excellent. These are important trends that have to be reviewed, and I guess it's something that is going to take more and more attention in these highly vaccinated regions, and there probably does require a very thorough investigation into what are the mechanisms. I think it's important for people, they may have some assumptions about what it could be. And I always say that there's an elephant in the room, and that elephant does need to be clarified, but we can't necessarily say that that is the cause of excess deaths. It's very important for us to do scientific research, but this is why it was disappointing that Andrew Bridgen wasn't given more attention in Parliament. Okay, let's move on to our main topic here with regards to the pandemic treaty. And I've pulled up here the World Health Organization Pandemic Preparedness Response Accord. And this is what they are preparing, and it's due to be signed over, I think, in May of 2024. A lot of people have no idea about this. Can you give us a quick summary, Amitav, as to what really this is about?
Yeah, that is a very important point you mentioned, that many people have no idea. Many professionals also do not have idea. And among professionals, I would say even public health professionals, because I have been circulating it among my colleagues in public health. Many people are not aware of the. I think one of the reason is that nobody has been taking this WHO. They are very unwieldy documents. I mean, I have been in public health for quite some time, so they are, not very interesting reading. But unfortunately, in this pandemic treaty and the amendments to the international health regulations, one has to really read the fine print. And if one reads the fine print and understands the implications, it can be quite uh, frightening. Actually, the tempo of the COVID-19 pandemic or panic, I would say, because if we see the data, whatever measures were taken during the pandemic, 3 years of the pandemic, say 2020, 21, 22, after the measures, things did not fall in place as it was promised. Like lockdown, it was promised that lockdown will check the transmission. It did not check the transmission. It's not possible. Or respiratory infection, by the time you come to know of the infection, by the time you identify the virus has already spread far and wide in the population. So there is no point in restricting measures for respiratory infection which spread so fast. So that was the first promise. The lockdown, it failed to check. Of course, initially it was to reduce the hospitalization to so that the hospitals are not overwhelmed. But subsequently, it became more ambitious, that you impose the lockdown and then you have a vaccine in record time. And after the vaccination, that transmission will be interrupted and life will come back to normal. So that promise also failed. So, and then the global panic was raised. And after the pandemic, there should have been an audit of measures, audit which worked, which did not work. As on today, we have no evidence that lockdown worked. As on today, we have no evidence that it checked the transmission, vaccine checks the transmission. So instead of having the audit, the WHO has gone into a more aggressive mode, and it has, the narrative now is that that because we do not have a good accord, we do not have a treaty, or because we do not have very stringent international health regulations, we should have this to prevent future calamities like the COVID-19. So if you
Could
actually,
I ask you a question there, Amitav? Do you think that without the pandemic, was this in the background before 2019, or did the pandemic lead to the initiation of this move for the treaty?
the pandemic gave it a push actually. This was already in the works. In fact, after the SARS one, or in fact, that time, 2005, the international health regulations were amended to some extent, but it wasn't as stringent as it is proposed now. Then the swine flu, 2009. That time also there were alarm of a pandemic, but many of the things like mass vaccination and other things, mandates, vaccine mandates were not pushed through. But the present pandemic came, and it was such a speed that there was no debate, there was no time to think. And the global health community, or the WHO and the CDC, they started running as if they are running a sprint with full speed, warp speed. Everything was as if they will check the transmission of a respiratory virus, which is epidemiologically not feasible. As I said, by the time the virus is identified, it has already spread far and wide in the community. You cannot stop a virus. Even as you say, during a pandemic, vaccination will not check the pandemic. I mean, I have heard on your channel, Dr. Geert, Professor Geert, and all says, as a virologist, he says that vaccination during a pandemic cause mutations. But as an epidemiologist, I can say from another point of view that vaccination does not work in a pandemic, because the vaccine immunity takes at least 2 weeks or 3 weeks or another two doses to give the immunity to the population. And whereas the natural infection spreads, incubation period is 3 to 5 to 7 days in a respiratory infection. So natural infection is spreading far wider, far than you can deploy the vaccine. So it is a waste of resources in a pandemic. During a pandemic, it will not check the transmission. I mean, even if a vaccine is effective, even in an effective vaccine. Similarly, with genome sequencing, that has become the new fashion. Genome sequencing, by the time it has to be in the community, that particular genome mutant. Once it is there, then only you detect it. And by the time the scientist detects in the lab, it's already spread. So it will always be one step ahead of the new vaccine or new mutant. So it's not, you can't catch up. These are natural phenomena. And that is the
So I just wanted to ask you though. So let's just pull back a second. Imagine there was no pandemic and things were going along as normal. So pre 2019. Is it necessarily a bad thing for an organization like the WHO to be able to create a consistent global response to a pandemic if it occurred? Why would that be a bad thing?
I think if there has been no panic of the pandemic, the public acceptance would have not been there. So I think this was a shock treatment required. Shock and awe was required to mentally prepare the people of things are going to get worse if you don't have a treaty. So this treaty, as it is a very abstract thing, and without a pandemic, it would have been more abstract. And this pandemic, whatever the measures they have taken, the treaty has got provisions for more stricter measures. I mean, the same medicine which has not worked, they are going to increase the dose. So that is what is concerning. That there should be a proper scientific debate, evidence-based public health, like what works, what doesn't work. So besides, instead of doing an introspection, the post-pandemic, there should be an introspection. There can be errors due to oversight or due to limited understanding. But now is the time to see what measures caused more harm than good. In fact, all the measures caused more harm than good, starting from lockdown, starting from school closures, You're talking of children rights. Actually, war, the most vulnerable are the children and other women. And so this declaring a war on a pandemic can have equally damaging effects on children, because
So when you look at what they're saying there's a broad range of topics: tobacco control, nuclear, chemical, biological weapons, climate change is included, and many other threats to our shared security. Again, a lot of the proponents of this will say this is a good thing. This is not a bad thing. And are we just getting people unnecessarily anxious about something that is in their best interest?
that would be best interest can only be by the evaluation of the evidence. So if the lockdown did not work, imposing lockdown is not in the best interest. Had it worked, it would have. Similarly, for mass vaccination, without evaluating the vaccine, I mean, forget about the side effects or adverse effects, the expenses, the cost of it. India spent 35,000 crores of rupees on the mass vaccination, which is 50% of the health budget. And as on today, the mortality from other diseases like dengue, tuberculosis, and other childhood diseases, every day 2,000 children are dying in India without COVID. So that got diverted, the resources got diverted. So this is not a good. That's why one size doesn't fit all. COVID may be a problem in the Western countries where higher age is there, obesity is there, comorbidities are there. But we have got a different disease priorities. So public health requires you're doing a community diagnosis first, the countrywide diagnosis of what are the disease priorities. And that's why this TT, which one size fits all principle, is not a very epidemiologically sound thing, because each country and culture is different, each demographics are different.
I'm going to bring in at the moment, Amitav, the perspective of Rob Roos, who is part of the European Parliament, and he had concerns as well about the pandemic treaty. I'm going to take you through his points, see what you think about it, and then we'll discuss it in a little bit here. So this is Rob Roos, and this is him making his discussion.
When I say pandemic, you're likely to scroll past. Everyone is tired of COVID, rightfully so. But please take a moment to keep watching. A new global pandemic treaty is in the works. The intention is for countries to respond in the same way during a future pandemic, more so than during the COVID-19 pandemic. There are 3 reasons why we should not desire this.
So I'm going to pause that here a minute, Amitav. And so far, I think that you are largely on board with what he is saying. Your perspective is that we shouldn't desire this. Would you say that's about right?
Yeah, that he has brought it out that the same year does not fit all countries. I mean, the same.
Okay.
Yeah.
We'll go on listening to his points. He's going to make 3 points now. So let's listen to point 1.
Reason 1. Who will manage the pandemic treaty? It is the World Organization, abbreviated as WHO. That may sound like a neutral government agency, but it is not. The WHO is heavily influenced by countries like China, as well as by the pharmaceutical industry. These are global players with tremendous geopolitical and financial interests. And who pays the piper calls the tune. Those interests don't always align with the interests of your country and its people. Now, the WHO wants to gain more authority through the pandemic treaty, while various other interests take precedence at the WHO. This is not good for our countries.
I'll pause it again here, Amitav. Any thoughts on what he had just said?
Yes, very rightly said. Like as I said, in ethics, first we see whether who are the funders, where is any conflict of interest. So when there are very heavy conflicts of interest, we do not get good science. So he has brought out, as on today, WHO 80%, I think, finance is by pharma industry. And of course, China may have some influence, but more important is it's not a neutral body. It is unaccountable, unelected, and the who decides pandemic is very important. As on today, we do not have a definition of pandemic which is agreed by all. I mean, if you see the COVID-19 pandemic, even now in the preamble to the treaty, they say that COVID was a very lethal virus or whatever. It may be lethal for some group of people. Any virus is lethal for the very elderly or people with comorbidity. But as long as the young and children and healthy were spared, a definition of pandemic is not very appropriate, particularly when on that definition you quarantine the healthy and young, because this also is not a proper pandemic response. Earlier pandemics, only the sick were isolated, not the healthy were isolated. So this is going in the wrong direction. It is going anti-epidemiology, anti-science.
Okay, let's listen to point 2.
Reason 2. The WHO is not democratically elected. Those who make decisions cannot be held accountable. This is a very bad idea. In a democracy, policymakers should be democratically elected and be held accountable accordingly. If we now commit ourselves to this new pandemic treaty, power will be further removed from the citizens. This is detrimental to national sovereignty and democracy.
Again, I'll pause that here. That's point number 2. Further thoughts on that, Amitav?
Yeah, this is, in fact, if you go to the amendments, the power, WHO also desires to take the power to declare a pandemic according to its own so-called scientist and any other scientific view. Forget about the power to the people. Other reputed scientists also in COVID-19 we saw, they were they were labeled as misinformation, or they were confined to the fringe of the profession. So, and another thing in the International Health Regulation Amendment is control of information. Control of information is never good for science. If information is misinformation, that can be rebutted by hard data and evidence. Just censoring it or making it, labeling it misinformation without giving valid reasons is not science. It is censorship, which is a sign of, I would say, authoritarianism or fascism. So this is, and particularly unelected people, unaccountable people. As I said, the COVID-19, now was the time to have an audit. What was wrong, what was acts of omission or acts of commission. Even if you do not punish those people or hold them accountable, at least you do not repeat the mistakes in future pandemics. But the treaty and the international health regulations, even without the amendments, without the treaty, the pandemic saw a lot of suppression of human rights, lot of draconian measures. So if we just forget, let the common person understand that without a treaty, without the international health regulations, they had to face so many hardships, none of which worked. With the treaty and with the amendments, how bleak the future will be, or how...
Yeah, perfect. Yep. All right, let's listen to point 3 from him. Oh, sorry about that.
Reason 3. The best approach during a pandemic is not the same everywhere. Consider culture, for example, but also consider population density, or how the balance between risk and freedom is preserved. It's not the same everywhere, therefore we should not implement the same policies everywhere. In summary, the new global pandemic treaty gives way too much power to the WHO. Firstly, it primarily serves the interests of countries like China and pharmaceutical giants. Secondly, we are giving away power to an organization that cannot be democratically controlled. Thirdly, the best approach to a pandemic is not the same everywhere. So we should really not support this pandemic treaty. If you share my concern, send an email with this video to the politicians in your country. And if you find this video informative, then please share it.
So that was Rob Roos from the European. I think he's from the Netherlands, and he was making those points quite eloquently, and so I think that one of the issues that I would be concerned about, and as I said, I'm trying to be balanced in terms of this discussion, but one of the issues I would be concerned about at the moment is I think that the huge mistake of not identifying the source of the virus that killed over 6.5 million people across the world, the fact that the WHO was not able to conclusively answer that, definitely needs an audit. And it does raise the question as to how could, if they are not able to address a point as critical as that, do they have the ability to control the other players who may be involved in pushing decisions? I think that's a very important point. Any thoughts on that, Amitav?
It's a very important point. In fact, one of the amendments calls for sharing of pathogens. So that is a very sinister thing. I mean, as One Health also is part of it, and that what are the potential viruses and pathogens which can jump from the animal kingdom. On the plea of that, there are some provisions to share, which I think is a dangerous thing, considering that there are countries or there are labs which are indulging in gain of function research. So mishaps can occur. So they should stay away from these pathogens. Nature has a lot of pathogens in the animal kingdom. And if you go and stand in front of nature, you may get infected, but it cannot be a threat as that disease X will come or some other will come. This is just to create public panic, and some gain of function research can go out of hand. Gain of function, they have got two reasons. First is they say they would be one step ahead of nature if there is a mutation and it spills, so the vaccine should be research for vaccines. Other is that if it is used as a bioterror weapon, we should be one step ahead of the year. So it would lead to something like a nuclear arms race. So this biological bioterrorism is one aspect, and second is some sort of accidents can happen from the lab, as COVID-19 has. So this is not a very appropriate thing. So
Yeah, so these are big questions. And I think that, as I said, the one big concern I had was with regards to the clarification as to where the virus came from. I think that that was a huge failure on the side of the WHO. The other thing is that I still maintain that after 3.5 years, to not clearly be able to define the primary pathophysiology in the disease is a terrible failure of the scientific community. And those things would give me great concern if you had an organization that would implement strategies that were not necessarily thoroughly scientifically verified or challenged and have been through scientific challenge. So I like to give balance to the discussion. And so I'm going to play now, Amitav, the perspective from the WHO as they try and answer some of these kinds of concerns, and then we'll discuss that a little bit further. So let's bring in this short clip from the WHO policy that I think was quite relevant. Got it here. So let's listen to what he has to say.
Hi, okay. This is Steven Solomon, and he's one of WHO's lawyers. Steven's got a stellar track of working on international health agreements, including Influenza Pandemic Preparedness Framework, or Tobacco Control Treaty, and many more. Steven is best placed to explain the legalities of the Pandemic Accord. So, let's begin.
Okay,
Great.
ready?
Thanks.
All right, here are some quotes for you to check out and tell our viewers what you think about it.
Okay, thank you.
The WHO are introducing a pandemic treaty that will mean they'll be able to take your tax dollars without listening to your opinion or giving you the chance to vote on it. Is that democracy?
Okay, this is interesting. Thank you. So this is Russell Brand, who I like and whose videos I watch. So there's no taxation in the treaty. The WHO is an intergovernmental organization. It doesn't tax. Only countries have the power
to tackle. But I think it's also important to say, and Russell Brand makes a very important point here, the question is, who decides? He often asks that question. In this case, it is countries that will decide. So the treaty aims to do three things: better preparedness for pandemics, better prevention of pandemics from starting in the first place, and when they hit, a better, fairer public health response to those pandemics. And at the same time, making sure that countries which are in the driver's seat and are in the driver's seat for writing it remain in the driver's seat for all of those things. Okay, next video.
They want to give themselves surveillance power, determine treatments, vaccine mandates, vaccine distribution, vaccine intellectual property and profits, and they want to redistribute basically everything in the name of pandemics.
So first of all, surveillance power. The treaty won't give surveillance power to WHO. What it would do, the treaty hopes to do, is to make surveillance, public health surveillance, faster, better, more reliable. Also, the treaty isn't going to give WHO power to dictate vaccine mandates. The treaty won't give WHO as an organization, as a staff, the power to dictate anything. And it's important because WHO provides an independent voice, independent of any particular country, independent of any particular interest group. And so recommendations from us, which are based on science and evidence, offer countries a tool, if they want to use it, to help their response.
But the fact is that this rhetoric around we want a cohesive global response, that's all well and good, but you have to ensure that those kind of ideas aren't subject to potential corruption.
So Russell Brand puts his finger on a critical issue. One of the tools which WHO has, which is really important in this, and was invented by WHO, by the countries in WHO before the pandemic, is something with a long title. It's called the Framework for Engagement with Non-State Actors. Short title is FENSA. And what FENSA is basically, it's a fence against conflict of interest. So we have ways of engaging with all these external actors, which may have an interest in what we're doing to reduce, hopefully eliminate conflicts of interest. Okay, next.
They are a group that has superpowers, not because they're awesome and can like split wood like Captain America, but because they are immune to social order.
This is important to clear up. We have what's called immunity. The speaker is absolutely right. When we do our jobs, we have to know that we can do them independently. So if we talk about the importance of tobacco control, in a country which has a lot of tobacco interests, we want our people to be able to work on tobacco control without fear that they may be in some sort of trouble or legal trouble if they're just doing their job. It's really important to question all of this. Any questions that you have in your mind that come up, you can drop comments below. You can look for opportunities if there are future public hearings. You can engage with your local and national health authorities. Again, it's the countries that are negotiating this.
So,
and we
Amitav,
really appreciate
are you convinced by what he has just said? Does it change any of your perspective?
One thing which actually makes everything weak, whatever Mr. Solomon said, and he without batting an eyelid, he says that WHO is totally independent without any conflict of interest and all that. So the main issue was it's heavily funded by pharma. It is heavily influenced by private corporate interests, and not only WHO, the WHO with its liaison with particularly developing countries like India, Africa, Asia, we are poor countries. So most of the funds are getting from the private pharma through the WHO projects or academic advancement and other things. Most of the researchers, national funding is very low all over the world. Most of the research, 70-80% research is funded by the foundations like Gates Foundation and other pharma, which are heavy stakes in pandemics. I mean, the diagnostic, the vaccines, the interventions, and If you see the science of epidemiology, science of public health, it is no emphasis is given on overall control of obesity in developed countries and control of malnutrition in poor countries. So these are the two drivers of mortality or morbidity from any pandemic, any viral infections. The stress is only on equal distribution of diagnostic drugs and vaccines. So, if actual World Health Organization wants to mitigate the impact of future pandemics, it should stress on positive health, particularly control of obesity, which was a major 3 times more obesity in the Western countries and 10 times more morbidity mortality from COVID we saw. Best example for Japan. Japan was a lean country, did not have mortality, whereas European countries, even Brazil had a younger age, but obesity was as high as Western countries. So so there were 10, 20 times higher mortality in countries with obesity. And similarly, other pandemics hit the malnourished children. Malnourished children are dying in African and Asian countries. So any viral infection can kill them, childhood infections.
So,
So
one of the other questions that I think I would have put to the WHO, and I'd be interested to hear your perspective on this, is that when vaccines came, so remember, late 2020 into 2021, everybody thought the vaccine was the saving solution. Yet, countries that were creating the vaccines chose to vaccinate way beyond their vulnerable before sharing any of their resources. And the WHO had no real control on that. And so, if you imagine that COVID 19 was actually as lethal as we were told, and that the vaccine was the only thing that could have saved lives, only 2% of Africa got vaccines. They would have decimated
yeah.
Africa because they did not have access to the resources. Any thoughts about that? How, I mean, in the sense of equitable distribution, it's a good idea, but is it practical?
It's not, it wouldn't have helped also, because Africa, it was the virus was not killing, it was the obesity which was killing. And it was the population naivety, I would say, like Africa, Asia, they are very crowded countries. So they are exposed to different coronaviruses, so there was some element of cross immunity can be thought of. And vaccine in Africa also, if you take South Africa, had the highest vaccination rate in Africa, but it had the higher mortality also, because the South Africa obesity was 3 times more than the other African countries. So the if you see, after 3 years, if I have been tabulating data, I found that whatever difference was before the rollout of the vaccine and after complete vaccination in the developed countries, and much less vaccination in Africa and to some extent Asia, the mortality differences remained the same. The 10 times more in Western compared to Asian, 20 times more compared to African continent. So whatever measures were taken at huge cost and perhaps benefit to pharma, they did not have much impact on the course of the pandemic, which was a more or less went its natural course, and it affected the vulnerable, particularly people with comorbidities and obesity and age, of course, age. So this data, we were getting the data, we were not getting age stratified data of mortality, morbidity, and similarly for the post vaccination also, we should have age stratified data of sudden deaths, which unfortunately, whatever data is available, it shows the younger people are affected more, particularly myocarditis and other certain concerning effects.
So Amitav, just imagine for a second, you've got a lot of experience, you're an epidemiologist, you've worked across multiple diseases in India. The WHO calls you and says, Professor Banerjee, we want you to lead our organization. What would you do that would be different?
I would have country-specific experts. I would definitely have the collaboration and coordination is definitely a good idea, and it should remain collaboration and coordination. What WHO treaty it is trying, it is going for control. Control is a war actually, and war can be there can be collateral harm. So I, as a epidemiologist, I would like to consult the regional epidemiologist, discuss with them, and each country may have a different strategy for a particular pandemic. The same pandemic behaves in a different way according to demographics, according to population density. Like in India, we did a lockdown, we increased the transmission because Indian houses are very crowded. So that this does not work. The same thing will not work. So one has to do. I would go around like a grandmaster who is looking at number of chess boards, and different chess boards simultaneously play. Big grandmasters, they play against 20, 30 players simultaneously. They don't play the same moves in every board. Every board, the positions, the chess pieces are same, but the game rules are same. Similarly, virus may be there, everything may be same, but each virus may behave like a game of chess. So epidemiology is as complex or more complex than a game of chess. So I would look at the different chessboards or different countries and consult the local grandmaster there, and accordingly, with collaboration, the strategy would be tailor made to that country, to the in that country. Like India is a very vast country with different climate, different population, different social status. So even in the same country, the strategy may be different at the regional level. So that one size fits all will not work, and it can harm more than it can work.
So these are important points, Amitav. And one of the questions that I'm reflecting on, and I was asked to ask you this question, and I want you to think about this. Politicians are all about power and control. What would make politicians across the world give up that degree of control in terms of a pandemic to an international organization? I really am baffled by the fact that across the world, the politicians are going along with this. From experience or from observation, they usually have to be given something for that to happen. Any thoughts?
They also enjoy power, so they may be partners in power, perhaps. Or some of them may be really, many may not be aware. I mean, these pandemics are very abstract things. Actually, many people, they really think that there is a existential crisis. So politicians, some of them may be still under shock, and others also may have conflict of interest are there, because politics is about money also, and sponsorship also, and lobbying also, and all this, and they have got the scientific advisors also. And as I said, the scientific advisors, they get funds from pharma. So there are small conflicts of interest. They are cumulative, and they are more than the sum total of all the conflicts of interest. So academics have conflict of interest. Research scientists have got conflict of interest. They get to do research, and they get award for research which is the current in the news. And what better thing to be in the news for a virus which is causing a pandemic? So all this adds up, and diseases which are there for long, like our country are having tuberculosis, dengue, they are not very glamorous, and they do not get so many funds, and they are affecting the poor country. So there are a lot of things which adds up. It's a whole web. So it's not a one-to-one relationship.
And one of the concerns I have, which you had highlighted as well, is that the WHO would be taking a view on censorship of or misinformation in this treaty. How does that work, and what would be different in the context of a WHO treaty that would make them stop the questioning of scientists, where scientists do have genuine questions that they don't have sensible answers for, but rather than answer them, they prefer to do censorship? Why would the WHO get involved with that?
They shouldn't, actually. If democracies were vibrant, if democracy will not, democracy should not allow censorship, and particularly scientific censorship. In science, nobody can claim to have the final answer. So there has to be dissent, there has to be debate. And if the WHO is doing censorship, it is anti-science, and that itself should disqualify it. I mean, that is one major aberration, that we are going away from science. We are going almost to medieval times, because as on today, the science can be give the data or say the data is required. Now there are data to show that lockdown did not work, there are data to show the vaccination did not check the transmission, there are data to show that children are not vulnerable, but still we are going against data. In USA, I believe they are recommending vaccine for children also, for 6 months, or they are trying that also. So this is something which is this makes us lose confidence in the WHO, makes us doubt the intentions of the WHO and its partners. This is the pharma industry, and maybe politicians of the world are also into it, because earlier it was the arms race which controlled the politicians. I suppose now it may be the pharma race which must be fast overtaking the arms race.
That's a very interesting point, because even within the umbrella is the question of climate change. And so climate change is now also a WHO priority. So we're kind of stepping from one thing to the other, from one crisis to next, which will then allow different individuals or different organizations to have a direct say in how countries behave with regards to their populations. This is a very complex thing. So, in your view, we should have the audit first rather
Yeah,
than. How
we
long would that take, though?
we should have the audit, and we should, in fact, I would call for, instead of a treaty, I would call for an amnesty. One of the reasons I feel the WHO is on the aggressive and the world governments are on the aggressive are because if it comes out that most of the measures, draconian measures, did not help, it caused harm, they accountability would be unimaginable. So that may be causing them to attack again with a pandemic treaty, to impose censorship and to declare another pandemic of disease X. I mean, this is something which one can never imagine, how you can have a pandemic of disease X and start preparing for it. So this, I think, is a defensive reflex to avoid the accountability of the omissions and commissions of the pandemic measures. So if we go for an amnesty and let us say, okay, what has happened is okay, we should not repeat the same mistakes. That would be a better way to go forward. And amnesty, we can have the science and we can have the evidence and what to do in the next pandemic and what not to do in the next pandemic. Here we are going with a higher dose of the same medicine, which includes surveillance, which includes vaccine, which includes suspension of individual rights. Censorship itself is a major violation. So we should go for an amnesty.
That's a very, very interesting point, Amitav, is that at the moment, I can imagine that politicians and public health leaders are very worried, and they will not want to be brought to account. And the only way sometimes to overcome that, where you can actually get back to science, is to say, we acknowledge your mistake, but we will not hold you accountable whilst we do the audit to make sure that it is done thoroughly. Do you think the public would ever accept that kind of thinking, Amitav?
Uh, well, it has to accept, otherwise the alternative is worse. And I think I come from the land of Gandhi, so Gandhi always forgave, and so did Jesus Christ. So I think we can move ahead. Otherwise, things. They even Sun Tzu said that when you corner an enemy, you should leave an exit. Otherwise, like a cat cornered, it can fight very ferociously. So I think if that is the only way forward. I mean,
Wow, that is very profound, Amitav. So listen, I want you to give me a summary conclusion as to where we are now and what would be your recommendations as the people are listening and they want to understand what should they be doing, because it feels as though this is purely political and doesn't actually impact the public in terms of the decision making. What should people do in the context of this kind of decision?
people should be at the front because people are the one who are actually going to be affected. In this pandemic also, they got affected more by the countermeasures to control the pandemic than by the pandemic itself. So people should be in the front, and I have a feeling that people are coming to the front, because when Andrew Bridgen was also making his speech in the UK Parliament, I could hear the sound of the people from the gallery. I think it was full, but MPs were not there. So they must be on the defensive. So people should ask every question. Like you mentioned about global warming, you mentioned about, there are concerns about carbon emission. So people should ask for the evidence base. What is the evidence base? Because global warming is also maybe genuine, but it is also becoming something like group thing. All academicians are talking of global, and they may be getting grants to work on global warming. And most of them are again modeling exercises, like which went off the track in the pandemic also. So people should question their elected representatives in a democracy, and that is the only way to be always on guard, because governments and politicians have their own interest, and sometimes they are compelled to follow a particular narrative. They are not as powerful as they may appear to be nowadays in a world which has become so much of pharma interest and corporate interest, and other even scientists also cannot be trusted to be independent because of their career prospects. Because if we saw in the pandemic, many scientists they lost their appointments, they lost their, some of them threatened with loss of license. So people cannot work with this, as the Mr. Solomon was saying, that advocate that WHO workers require immunity. Similarly, scientists also require immunity from such victimization. So we are talking of only WHO scientists who require immunity for a treaty which they will get immunity and all that. What about the scientists who did not get immunity during the pandemic? So you are giving a message to people at middle level and junior level scientists who are in the career for survival. You are giving a message that you toe the line. This is not science. Why immunity to only WHO scientists, and all other scientists will be censored as misinformation? It's not fair, not a level playing field. I would like to debate with Advocate Solomon.
Yes, quite right, Amitav. Appreciated as usual your deep and thoughtful and comprehensive answers to many of these issues. I hope that people are listening and got a better understanding of the challenges in front of us with regards to this pandemic treaty. I think it's due to be formally signed off in May of 2024. So there is still time to push your politicians to make sure they do what is in the interest of yourself and your countries. So, just before we finish, I'd again like to remind everyone to think about what is happening in the Middle East. Let us all remember that as a world, we need to be all together as one. And that whilst I don't have a solution, I do hope that there is peace on behalf of all the children. So thank you again, Amitav. I
Thank you.
really, really look forward to talking to you again, and I'll make sure that we include you in our next upcoming thing. So have a great evening,
Thank
and I
you.
know it's late in India. Have a good
Yeah.
night.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a pleasure always, Philip. Thank you.
Okay, then.